Okay, well, I think it's time to get started. We want to respect everyone's time. We have a lot of speakers, and I'm expecting there will be a lot of questions as well. So we want to dive right in. My name is Paul Pasimino. I am the Associate Director at Amazon Watch, and you are part of an investor briefing about Chevron, and specifically resolutions that Chevron will be facing this month at the annual general meeting. I want to thank the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia, Follow This, Sierra Club, Majority Action, New Ground Social Investment, Investor Advocates for Social Justice, and especially the Union of Concerned Scientists for making this possible. There's been a lot of work and care put into pulling this together and a lot of time donated by the speakers. So thank you all for participating. And I hope there will be more that we can say and work together on in the future, especially on climate justice and on the fossil fuel industry in general and what's happening with Chevron. The reason that we're having this, well, one big reason is the fact that there are many resolutions, as you will see, that Chevron and the entire industry is facing. Essentially, what I've termed a reckoning that the fossil fuel industry and specifically Chevron is having to deal with, because investors are increasingly concerned, and the entire community, the human rights community, environmental justice community, concerned about the ongoing practice of violating human rights, destroying the environment, lack of accountability, misinformation, legal retaliation, targeting activists, targeting shareholders, targeting organizations who are speaking out against violations of environmental justice, violations of the rights of communities that are within areas where Chevron operates, and also its impact on our global climate. So for all of these reasons, year after year, we've seen more and more pointed resolutions offered by shareholders. And in many cases, if not all cases, response from management has been lacking, to put it mildly. So we wanted to pull together experts some who have moved specific resolutions, some who are simply speaking in support of them, or have direct stories to share about the impact of Chevron's operations on their community, so that the socially responsible investment community and the press and the environmental justice community can learn specifically what people are doing to try to press Chevron to do the right thing, to improve its practices, to increase accountability and change not only the practices of Chevron, but move this industry that is so responsible for climate chaos that we are experiencing on a daily basis around the globe. The idea here, obviously, is to talk specifically about resolutions. I will go through each speaker and we will break it down into 3 or 4 groups. We'll talk about corporate governance, environmental and racial justice, human rights, and climate. And after each group of speakers, if we have specific questions we can answer quickly, we will take those questions. If not, we will leave those to the end so that we can give every speaker a chance to give their presentation within a decent amount of time. I want to respect people's time. So if you have a question at any point, please feel free to post it in the Q&A chat in the Zoom. Please also indicate who you are and who you are with when you post your question. We will be tracking all of them and get to as many as we can. There will also be a recording of this webinar available by tomorrow. We will issue a press release. It will have a way to get in touch with speakers if you have follow-up questions. If you have any questions that you want to send right away, my email is paz@amazonwatch.org. Anybody can send those to me directly and I will make sure you get a response. I believe that's all we need to get things rolling, and we will start talking about corporate governance. So I'd like to introduce Ivy Schlegel, with a senior research analyst with Majority Action, who will talk about their exempt solicitation.
Great, thanks, Paul. Good morning, everybody. It's so great to be here. I think, are my slides up? I'm not sure if there we go, thank you. So at the moment, Chevron is experiencing a lapse in responsible corporate governance and is not accountable to its shareholders. When boards fail to adequately oversee and mitigate risks or respond to majority vote shareholder proposals, shareholders have no option but to withhold votes and hold the board accountable. In 2021, majority action recommended votes against CEO and board chair Michael Wirth and lead independent director Ron Sugar on the basis of failure to transform its corporate business practices to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This year, votes against these directors are again warranted, and again for these same climate-related criteria, as well as 2 additional components demonstrating Chevron's overall lack of board accountability. So we detail these criteria in the exempt solicitations, which we filed with the SEC, and I believe those links will be in the chat if you have not already seen them. Sorry, let me turn my, so I can turn my Slack notifications off. Apologies for that. Next slide, please. You'll hear more in depth from other speakers on climate, so I just want to touch on this first criteria somewhat briefly, but this is really important. Firstly, as one of the world's largest greenhouse gas emitters and one of the Climate Action 100+ focus companies, Chevron has failed to take necessary steps to reduce its emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Despite making some partial improvements from last year, Chevron still fails to meet investor expectations. Chevron's net zero by 2050 aspiration only includes emissions from its own operations and excludes emissions from the products it sells, which represent the vast majority of Chevron's emissions. Reaching net zero by 2050 and limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is in the best interest of long-term diversified shareholders. The International Energy Agency's net zero by 2050 roadmap clearly states that by 2050, fossil fuel demand will be substantially reduced and that no new oil and gas is needed beyond what's already approved. So this means to be Paris aligned means no new oil or gas expansion. An analysis by Carbon Tracker has found that to be compliant with this net zero by 2050, Chevron would have to cut its production by 70%. Chevron has not committed to any cuts in production, has no strategy to realign capital expenditures to a net zero scenario, and in fact has publicly stated that it does not believe that this IEA net zero scenario is even likely. Chevron even admits, we believe that an absolute scope 3 target is incompatible with our strategy that includes increasing oil and gas production. Chevron has also failed to align its lobbying and political influence activities with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. The second reason votes against directors are warranted are Chevron's failure to adequately respond to majority-supported climate-related shareholder proposals in the last 2 years. In 2021, this is the right slide, sorry. In 2021, 60.7% of shares voted supported a resolution requesting that Chevron substantially reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of their energy products, scope 3. In October, Chevron published updated GHG reduction targets. However, these were not responsive to the key elements of the majority vote proposal. In addition to the net zero 2050 ambition, excluding scope 3 emissions, the company set an interim target to reduce greenhouse gas intensity across all scopes by 5%. So this intensity only reduction does not guarantee any reduction in absolute scope 3 emissions if oil and gas production continues to rise, which Chevron's own production forecasts indicate that it will. So in explaining why it chose not to implement the proposal as written, Chevron asserts that it engaged with shareholders and claims that most quote unquote investors agree with the company that scope 3 emissions are not appropriate for Chevron. The company's engagement with this was with investors representing only 39% of its stock, and it did not clarify how stakeholders were selected or how they voted or provided additional rationale on that selection. So their overall rationale is not enough to justify not implementing a majority vote of shareholders. And this lack of responsiveness mirrors Chevron's lackluster response to the 2020 shareholder proposal on climate lobbying. Next slide, please. This received a majority support, 53.5% of shares voted. But then Influence Map assessed the climate lobbying report that Chevron published and assessed it against 7 investor expectations on climate policy engagement disclosures. Of these, Chevron failed to meet 5 of these 7 expectations and only partially met 2. So Chevron's failure to implement majority-supported shareholder proposals is at odds with major investor proxy voting standards and corporate governance best practices. Next slide, please. The third reason votes against directors are warranted: additional independent oversight is critically needed on Chevron's board. Chevron CEO Michael Wirth is also the board chair, which removes critical independent oversight of management. The lead independent director, Ron Sugar, is heavily overboarded, serving on 4 boards and other advisory positions. And as well, he's been on the board for 17 years, which calls into question his ability to provide independent oversight. And lastly, there are multiple board interlocks as several members serve on other boards together, which has been shown to make directors even less inclined to challenge the status quo. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we'd like to offer some opportunities that Chevron shareholders have. So as you hear from the following speakers, voting for the climate, human rights, and racial justice shareholder proposals send an incredibly powerful signal. Failure to take climate action, respond to shareholder proposals, and ensure independent oversight are serious failures of strategy and corporate governance. And especially at companies where fossil fuels are central to the core business and where greenhouse gas emissions reductions have profound strategic implications, the board chair and where it exists, lead independent director have absolute oversight responsibility and should be held accountable. Therefore, a vote to hold Chevron's board leadership accountable is a vote for responsible corporate governance. So we encourage you as investors to vote against Ron Sugar and Michael Worth at the Chevron's AGM on May 25th, to vote for the shareholder proposals, to announce your votes in advance, and to hold your asset managers accountable for their proxy voting on climate. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivy. And if there are specific questions, we'll take them at the end of the section or at the end of all the presentations. Next, we'd like to hear from Alfredo Angulo. Alfredo is a community organizer and part of the Richmond Progressive Alliance, and an environmental justice activist and advocate. We think it's critically important to hear from frontline community members who are the first to experience the impacts of Chevron's operations. And if you're unaware of the specific situation in Richmond, this will be a particularly enlightening presentation. Thank you so much, Alfredo.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everybody. My name is Alfredo Angulo. I use they, them, its pronouns. I want to talk to you about our experiences as Richmond residents living next to the Chevron refinery, the second biggest polluter in the state of California, in hopes that you can understand some of the impacts that your corporation has on our lives, on our families, especially in a majority minority community like ours. I'm an organizer, as Paul said, for the Listening Project. I am a senior at UC Berkeley studying political science, but more importantly, I'm a lifelong resident of Richmond. I've been to every Cinco de Mayo parade on 23rd Street since I was born and played at every park west of Interstate 80. I'm a product of the city of Richmond. It's made me who I am today. Living there, I've also breathed in the toxic chemicals from every flaring event in the last 22 years. I've experienced every oil spill, every fire, every gas leak from the second oldest refinery in California. And so have my 113,000 or so brothers and sisters, my neighbors. We've witnessed the corporation not only neglect the health of our community, but actively fight against it. When just a couple of months ago, the United Steelworkers Local 5 oil workers went on strike to demand more protections for the health of their workers and of our community at large. Chevron refused to listen and accept their demands. Oil workers have testified to us personally that they have witnessed shady practices by management to try and hide the worst of the pollution from air monitors. Needless to say, the workers are still on strike. In 2015, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District passed Regulation 6.5 to protect public health, requiring that refineries bring themselves to cleaner emission standards by reducing particulate matter emissions, using technology that was already readily available to refineries and already widely used by refineries in the state of California. And Chevron sued the Air District, and the case is still up in court. And these are just a few examples of a pattern of neglect that the refinery has shown for our community. We've suffered from generations of fossil fuel operations in Richmond, where we are one of the most susceptible communities to respiratory illnesses. We also live next to, again, the second largest single polluter in the state of California. According to data from Contra Costa Health Services, we experience 300 times the amount of pollutants than do our neighbors just across the bay in San Rafael. 1 in every 4 children that grow up in Richmond are diagnosed with asthma, not to mention the insane cancer rates in communities that live nearest the refinery and the railroad. Our schools have different physical education regimens for a lot of our children because an overwhelming amount of them have asthma and can't keep up. We've heard through our own research from doctors that mothers are worried about asthma risk in their children from the day they're born, asking not will their child have asthma, but when will their child have asthma. That has been our experience living next to the refinery. A refinery that I imagine to some of you might look like a dying asset, especially as we start to transition away from fossil fuels. But this aging refinery is in need of care and strong oversight as it continues to function, because the bigger asset to us, and one that no amount of money or investment will replenish, is our health. The health of our children, our grandparents, and the everyday people who make the Bay Area function. But the refinery does so much more than pollute our air, water, and soil, our physical landscape. They actively work to pollute the political environment through their use, through their massive economic stronghold that they use to try and buy city council and local board seats. In 2014, Chevron spent $3 million propping up their own city council candidates that they fully funded, engaging in smear campaigns against our city leaders like Eduardo Martinez, Melvin Willis, and former Mayor Gail McLaughlin, beloved community members. Through negotiations with the city, they have become a massive funding source for some of our nonprofits, our schools, and our city resources, creating a stronghold that makes everyone fearful for the day that Chevron, like many other companies in the 1960s, divests from our city. They work to skew public opinion on the refinery through propaganda. I'm sure that you've all been aware of the Richmond Standard, a newspaper that is completely funded by Chevron. To become one of the most known in Richmond. And you'll see reports on anything from sideshows to shootings and robberies, but not a mention of the refinery's increased flaring, or the massive oil spill that just a couple months ago filled the bay, or the massive threat that the climate crisis poses to our community. This selective output of information works with the intention of skewing public opinion in their favor. That is what your company is doing, and it is polluting our city. The refinery has always been a massive part of our city story. It was established before, the city of Richmond was even a town. It was a massive source of employment in the early days of Richmond, but we have to recognize that we are a different state, we're a different world, a world that the refinery and your company have to adapt to. Thank you for your willingness to listen. I look forward to hearing from our other partners. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can check us out at richmondlisteningproject.org. We have a whole podcast where I talk about just this, but super more in depth. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Alfredo. I also want to lift up that if you're in the Bay Area on May 21st, you can join us at the Richmond Refinery on Anti-Chevron Day for a large action led by local groups in Richmond who are calling for support from the local and international community. So you can find out more about that at truecostofchevron.com and RSVP. Next, I'd like to invite Sister Nora Nash of the St. Francis of Philadelphia, and Jillian Lyon, Senior Program Associate with the Investor Advocates for Social Justice, to talk about the resolution on a racial equity audit. That's item number 9.
Yes, good afternoon, Paul. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and certainly thanks to all for being with us today. I know we have a large group of folks who have come to stand by us and to be with this total group. And actually, I want to ask you, why are you here? And what is May 25th? Is there anything special about it? Yes, there is something very, very special. All of us, participants and panelists, will use our proxies to deliver a united message to Chevron to stop the company from exploiting our people, our planet, and especially our communities within any proximity to oil rigs, substations, transmission stations, old oil wells, and especially toxic refineries, as we just heard from Alfredo. Chevron has failed to recognize that each individual person is a rights holder, and no matter what race, creed, or color, each has a God-given right to clean water, pure air, and other natural resources. Do you all agree? One would never know that many of us, many probably participating today, have worked for umpteen years with Dr. Richard Leroff to bring Chevron into the fold. We had 12 key performance indicators, and we are still outraged that fracking and toxic pollution from oil refineries continue to perpetuate every kind of injustice, especially racial injustice for those who are near any of the above facilities. And that is why the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia and 19 other faith-based, socially responsible co-filers have filed a racial equity audit with Chevron. And as you can see from slide 1, the resolve clause asks Chevron to commission and publicly disclose the findings of an independent racial equity audit. The audit should analyze if and how Chevron's policies and practices discriminate or disparately impact communities of color. The report should identify and recommend steps to eliminate business activities that further systemic racism, environmental injustice, threaten civil rights, or DEI. I would like to look very carefully for us at the last input, the impacted workers and the community members, such as Alfredo, customers, or other relevant shareholders, should inform the audit and report. So that would give Alfredo a tremendous opportunity to be a participant. Slide number 2, please. In this slide, we are hoping that we will be able to include a 30-second blurb from the LP podcast, again from a member, Eduardo Martinez. We know that Chevron continues to racially disparate outcomes via exacerbating climate crisis, which disparately impacts people of color, and further systemic racism. Pollutants discharge and leaks disparately affect communities of color. Political advocacy appears to be misaligned with racial equity and upholding civil rights. And I think we have a 30-second.
Chevron pollutes Richmond's air with flaring, our water with spills resulting in health issues, clinic and hospital bills, lost time at work and at school, lowered productivity when our health allows. Chevron pollutes our city with misinformation about anyone holding them accountable, misinformation about the toxins they release, misinformation about the damage they do to animals, plants, people. Chevron pollutes our economy by refusing to pay their fair share in taxes, by putting their profit over the health of our community.
Thank you, Eduardo. And before we go to slide 3, I would like to say, because Pennsylvania is a natural gas state, I have had many opportunities to visit with families who were impacted by gas drilling. There was no such a thing as FPIC or human rights, just dollars for those who had mineral rights. In one small neighborhood in Western Pennsylvania, I visited several times. And speaking about one family, I'll just make it simple by saying, first, the dog died from drinking the water. Next, the dad died from complications of the gas industry right on the top of the hill. And the mother had many, many serious issues and brought them to the state. However, just about everyone in that small community was impacted. Most had cancer, nosebleeds, and other signs that it was not a natural environment. One of the most touching things that I have ever done was put gallons of water by each mailbox in that little community. I felt terrible because I could walk away brokenhearted at the fate of this small community, which was already ruined by the gas company. And that company was Chevron. Chevron is no longer in Pennsylvania. Now I'd like to introduce Jillian.
Thank you so much, Sister Nora. If you move to this slide, great. I am going to quickly share 3 main reasons why investors should support the proposal asking for a racial equity audit. Number 1, racist policies and practices expose Chevron to material risk as the company exacerbates racial inequities via its contributions to climate change, pollutants and leaks, and public policy advocacy, including lobbying and funding of police foundations tied to police brutality that is misaligned with racial equity and upholding civil rights. 2, Chevron is not adequately managing these material risks. It faces multiple lawsuits alleging damages from climate impacts that disparately affect Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Its risk management systems are insufficient and score poorly on human rights benchmarks for failing to implement its own policies. And 3, racial equity audits are increasingly viewed as good governance and risk management for companies. The high volume of shareholder proposals filed on this topic, the high votes they received, and the number of companies conducting these audits signals strong support from all stakeholders. So in conclusion, we urge all shareholders to vote for Proposal 9 asking for a racial equity audit to bring accountability to Chevron's policies and practices that violate the rights of our Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Nora and Julianne. I want to move us next to Simon Billanis. Simon's Executive Director of the International Campaign for the Rohingya and Director at No Business with Genocide, to speak about item 8, the resolution about not doing business with governments complicit in genocide. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much. And I'm putting a little petition in the oops, I'm going to put a little petition in the contact in the comments as well that people can check out as they go along. But you know, one thing I'd sort of put to people right away is, you think in this day and age you wouldn't have to tell companies not to do business with governments engaged in genocide, and you would think that if you did bring that up with a company, not once, but twice, in fact, even 3 times in the form of a shareholder resolution, that company would stop doing business with that government that is engaged in genocide. And you think that after that, in that country, after the military seized power and gained total control of that government, that Chevron would do everything it could to make sure that it didn't pay any money, any further money to that military junta. And if you think that that would be reasonable, and if you think that wouldn't happen in the world, then you got to look at Chevron and how it's operated in Myanmar over the last couple of decades. In the case of Myanmar, it's a country in Southeast Asia, and which has been under military rule for almost all of its history since 1962, with a brief period of 2015 through February 1st, 2021, when there was a hybrid military-civilian government, which was ended on February 1st, 2021 with a military coup when they took over total power. And in March of this year, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, announced that the US administration had formally determined that violence committed against the Rohingya ethnic minority by Myanmar's military amounts to genocide and crimes against humanity. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum has reported that the Rohingya in Myanmar remain, quote, at grave risk of additional mass atrocities and even genocide, unquote. This is the situation that Chevron is in. And again, you would think that faced with this situation and with the recommendation by its own shareholders in the form of an exempt solicitation, which you'll have, that Chevron would do everything it could to make sure that having announced that it would finally withdraw from Myanmar, it would do so in a way that wouldn't, again, give more money to the Myanmar military that's been committing this genocide, been committing these crimes against humanity. But, you know, we're talking about Chevron here, and Chevron doesn't follow the rules of accepted behavior that you would think that any other company would normally do, and would avoid its complicity in genocide. So that's why we're here. Now, Chevron is the largest US investor in Myanmar and holds equity in the Adana gas field and pipeline project. And since its inception, the Adana project has generated billions of dollars for the Myanmar military junta. Oil and gas companies are one of the largest sources of revenue for the Myanmar military since it seized power. And in Myanmar, foreign participation in the energy sector takes place through joint ventures directly with the Myanmar government. And now that the Myanmar military has seized total control again over the government, the Myanmar military is Chevron's business partner. So the resolution that we also brought in 2017 and 2018, it's not like Chevron wasn't warned about this. The resolution requests the board of Chevron to simply publish a report evaluating the feasibility of adopting a policy of not doing business with governments that are complicit in genocide or crimes against humanity, as defined in international law. Again, you'd think this would be something that any company would do, but not Chevron. Now, over the course of its investment operations in Myanmar, Chevron has incurred mounting financial and reputational damage from its partnerships with the Myanmar military junta. And in fact, now following this February 2021 military coup, Chevron has been forced to exit Myanmar and exit the Adana project. They say they're trying to find a buyer for their interest. And if they could find a buyer, it would certainly be at a fire sale price. So the shareholders who brought this resolution believe that Chevron has a duty to avoid both these mounting damages to shareholder value, as well as the increasing moral, legal, financial, reputational, and operational risks posed by doing business with a government engaged in genocide and engaged in crimes against humanity. And the shareholders believe it's incumbent on the board of Chevron to adopt policies that would monitor these damages and risks and protect shareholder value from them. Now, there's nothing in Chevron's human rights policy or its business conduct and ethics code to indicate that Chevron does any prior or ongoing due diligence on governments with which it does business as an oil company. And Chevron has cited these policies as the reason why they don't need to adopt this policy of not doing business with genocidal regimes. But there's nothing in those policies that protects the companies and protects shareholders from those risks. And so, shareholders are simply asking that management should develop procedures for monitoring governments with which they do business or may do business in the future that are at risk of engaging in genocide or crimes against humanity. And Chevron should develop guidelines for screening potential government business partners, as well as developing procedures for responsible disinvestment from countries as warranted. One of the things that shareholders have been urging in their exempt solicitation, basically their letter to other shareholders, asking shareholders to support this resolution, they have asked Chevron to use its options in its contract to send to international arbitration the question of who represents the government of Myanmar following this military coup. Because right now in Myanmar, you have the military junta that seized power, but you also have members of the previous civilian government, people who won elections in 2020, but prevented from taking up their seats in parliament by the military. It's called the National Unity Government of Myanmar. And they have said, no, the military junta does not represent Myanmar. And so any payments that are due the government of Myanmar should not go to the junta. And so shareholders are asking Chevron, as part of its responsible disinvestment from Myanmar, to go to international arbitration, which Chevron loves to do. They love to take issues to international arbitration, and to take to international arbitration under the provisions of its contract the question of who represents the government of Myanmar, whether it's the junta, whether it's the National Unity Government of Myanmar, and in the meantime, put any payments that are due the government of Myanmar into escrow. Seems like a very reasonable thing to do, but again, Chevron has resisted doing this for well over a year now, since the military seized power in the February 2021 military coup. So that's where we are. I have put into the comments, we have a petition to TIA-CREF, asking TIA-CREF to vote in favor of the resolution. TIA-CREF, even though they bill themselves as a socially responsible investor, they voted against this resolution in 2018. And so we're asking TIA-CREF and also other investors, given the change in the situation, given the mounting damage to Chevron's shareholder value, and to vote in favor of the resolution this year, and to make sure that Chevron, and also to hold up Chevron as an example of the damage and the risks to companies that occur when companies are complicit in genocide and support governments that carry out genocide or other crimes against humanity. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll be I'd be delighted to take your questions.
Thank you, Simon. And apologies, I should have announced before that we were moving to the section regarding human rights specifically. We will answer the questions that have been coming in most likely at the end. Unless questions are specific to the actual presentation that just ended, we'll save those. So we will track and respond to your questions. Next, we'd like to share a message sent in by Donald Moncayo, who is the president of UDAT, which is the organization that represents the communities affected by Chevron Texaco in Ecuador. This message is in support of item number 10. You're also going to hear another speaker talking about item number 10. It's important to lay out quickly that if you don't know, Chevron was found liable for $9.5 billion on February 14th, 2011 for the deliberate discharging of at least 16 billion gallons of toxic oil waste into the Ecuadorian Amazon from the years 1964 to 1992 when it operated under its Texaco brand. Chevron has refused to pay that and instead waged a retaliatory legal attack against the Ecuadorians and their lawyers. This is a message from Donald, recorded just recently, showing the current levels of contamination, and a direct message from UDAT to shareholders.
Mi nombre es Donald Moncayo, yo nací un 20 de noviembre de 1973 a 200 metros del segundo pozo que perforó Texaco aquí en la Amazonía ecuatoriana por los años de 1967. Hoy, 2 de mayo del 2022, siendo aproximadamente las 3 de la tarde con 45 minutos hora de Ecuador, me encuentro en una de las piscinas que fue construida, utilizada y abandonada por Chevron en el pozo Aguarico 4. Este pozo fue perforado en el año de 1974 y abandonada en el año de 1984. Así que todo lo que ustedes están viendo a través de este video es exclusivamente de Texaco. Aquí Petroecuador no sacó un solo barril de petróleo. Hoy Chevron pretende decir que estas piscinas no son de ellos, que estas piscinas son del Estado ecuatoriano, cuando en realidad se beneficiaron económicamente ellos de estas piscinas, a la hora de arrojar en estas piscinas los lodos de perforación, las aguas de perforación, el petróleo de prueba y además todo el mantenimiento de pozo que hacían. Estas piscinas no tienen ningún recubrimiento, ni geomembrana, ni plástico, ni hormigón, ni tampoco tienen una protección para proteger que no ingresen los animales tanto domésticos como salvajes. Como esta piscina, construyeron 880 piscinas en una área de 450,000 hectáreas aquí en la Amazonía ecuatoriana. Más de 1.700 kilómetros de vías de acceso, 22 estaciones de separación, donde arrojaron más de 60,000 millones de litros de agua de formación. Ustedes podrán ver la profundidad de estas piscinas iba desde los 3 metros hasta los 4 metros, hasta los 6 metros de profundidad. Y ese petróleo que realmente cayó en esas lagunas, cayó en esos pantanos, no es como dice la empresa, que fue el pantano, que fue la laguna, la encargada de desaparecer todo este desecho. Ese petróleo se encuentra ahí con sedimentos. Está en los pantanos, está en los riachuelos, está en las lagunas. Y Chevron, otra mentira más, que dijo que como esta piscina remedió 162 piscinas con un acuerdo que tuvo con el Estado ecuatoriano de 1995 a 1998. Su acuerdo fue echarle tierra y dejar el petróleo ahí. La remediación del gato le llamamos acá. Cuando el gato hace sus necesidades biológicas, luego de pegarse la cagada, la tapa con tierrita. Así mismo hizo Chevron acá. 162 piscinas donde quedó el petróleo tapado, quedó ocultado. Esa es la remediación que Chevron ejerció acá. Quiero que vean mi mano. En realidad, esta es la calidad de agua que Chevron dice que está apta para el consumo humano y que aquí no pasa nada, que aquí está todo bien, que lo único que existe acá es un grupo de colonos e indígenas expertos y abogados que se han unido con el único propósito de robarles el dinero a ellos. Eso es lo que ellos dicen, pero la realidad es esta. Nosotros como afectados por Chevron habíamos venido hablando del exceso de cáncer que había aquí en la Amazonía ecuatoriana por muchos años. Desde el 2015 nos propusimos hacer una investigación realmente de cuánto cáncer había aquí en la Amazonía ecuatoriana. Primeramente empezamos con un diagnóstico, con unas encuestas, se hicieron más de 1.500 encuestas a campesinos, a profesores, a niños, donde se logró identificar que habían más de 2.000 personas que habían muerto por cáncer. Siendo así, el cáncer al útero como en primer lugar. Luego, el cáncer de mama, el cáncer de estómago, el cáncer al cuello, el cáncer a los pulmones, leucemia hacia los niños. Para nosotros, estos 11 años que Chevron sigue de prófuga de la justicia ecuatoriana por este crimen ambiental cometido acá, se han apagado centenares de vidas de personas por la enfermedad del cáncer. Señores accionistas, señores de la empresa de Chevron, no sé cuántas personas más quieren que siga muriendo por este crimen cometido por ustedes. No sé hasta dónde ustedes quieren llegar. Ya basta. Señores accionistas, si ustedes tienen familia, sepan que este daño que ocasionaron acá rompen lazos familiares donde quedan niños huérfanos de padres y madres porque han perdido la vida por cáncer, rompen realmente con un futuro de esos niños porque al no tener a sus padres y a sus madres realmente no tienen una esperanza de vida digna como todo ser humano se lo merece en este mundo. No sé qué esperan. Se logró demostrar al cansancio 105 informes del daño que cometieron acá. Se logró demostrar realmente que en su operación no hubo cuidado del ambiente, de la naturaleza, ni de la salud de las personas. Basta. Esto debe de parar. Chevron debe de pagar.
I want to thank Donald and Udap for recording and sending that. Obviously incredibly powerful video, and anybody who wants to go see with their own eyes, Donald takes Toxie tours through that area and has been doing so for many, many years. So you can get in touch with me at Amazon Watch if you want to arrange a trip to see for yourself. Unfortunately, the damage in Ecuador is not just an exception. This is the method and process that Chevron has used globally, which is why I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, who has produced a report actually documenting the many cases that brought by local communities and governments against Chevron's for its similar operations around the globe. And part of the reason that item number 10 is something we hope you will all vote for. So Professor Nan Greer is the Executive Director of All Star International, and we'll talk about that report, Chevron's Global Destruction, and item number 10.
Hello, my name is Dr. Nan Marie Greer. I'm an environmental anthropologist and the Executive Director of Alistar International, a nonprofit organization specializing in human rights and community assistance, and former professor at the University of Hawaii and the University of Redlands. Last year, I conducted a global assessment of Chevron's activities around the world. I spent 3 weeks reviewing primary news sources publicly available on the internet, and the 71 cases I found were revolting. I was astounded to find Chevron violating domestic and international laws with impunity, country by country. I wrote a report detailing each of the 71 cases, and it's available at chevronsglobaldestruction.com. It was also written into the congressional record when Senator Rashida Tlaib asked CEO Mike Wirth to explain Chevron's failure to pay at least $50 billion in damages owing in only these cases. He was the only big oil CEO who refused to address any such questions at the congressional hearing, not during nor after. Rather, Chevron in court told the US government any recovery of even the Ecuadorian judgment would cause irreparable damage to the company, while also reporting to the SEC any court liabilities possessed no material costs to their company. I found Chevron has used vast financial resources, political muscle, bribes, and retaliatory litigations to squash lawsuits and incident reports from communities and countries affected by their oil and gas extraction. Chevron appears to be among the most destructive oil companies in the world, destroying land and ocean ecosystems, poisoning rivers and streams, eliminating livelihoods, ravaging communities, and financing paramilitary violence, while filing frivolous and punitive litigations against anyone who dares hold the company responsible for its crimes. Chevron has even violated over 14 human rights mandates of the United Nations, not to mention failing to adhere to US embargoes and foreign investment restrictions. In Nigeria, Chevron caused entire communities to lose food sources, with lands polluted beyond abilities to raise crops, and food caught from the sea, now called oil fish. There, the average lifespan has been reduced to below the age of 50, my age. The Ilage protested Chevron's presence, and many were shot, beaten, and tortured as a result. Their case was brought to the United States, and now Chevron demands that the community members in abject poverty to pay all their inflated legal costs. In Coloma, Chevron's Endeavor rig blew up and flares burned for 46 days before the company did anything to stop it. Well, the people on the shore breathed the smoke and deadly chemicals that also destroyed their lives. Appealing for assistance in resettlement, the company litigated any and all claims, refusing assistance to the people. In Ecuador, Chevron left 1,000 toxic pits for the indigenous people on their homelands, refusing to pay the judgment of $9.5 billion for damages, where they attacked their lawyers, killing the brother of one, falsely imprisoning another for over 900 days. And now they demand an international tribunal forces Ecuadorians to pay $800 million in legal fees. In Kazakhstan, with pipelines leading to Russia, Chevron has caused oil spills and gas flarings that abuse the rights of 4,000 people, with 1,400 finding their children poisoned by petrochemicals and diagnosed with brain damage of toxic encephalopathy. No payments were made to the families. A pipeline from Chad to Cameroon displaced 22,000 Bakola Pygmy indigenous, destroying their water and food sources, as well as raping and abusing their women. They even refused to pay $1.4 billion owed to Chad during their operations, leading to the collapse of the country, much as they refused to pay the Saudi families the $17.5 billion owed to them after drilling after contract dates, as decided recently in the Egyptian International Arbitration Court. Even Native Americans in our own country have failed to receive $95 million in royalties on oil extracted on their lands. Instead, they bribed the US government, giving them $45 million that indigenous never received. My report about Chevron is not something to be tucked away. Families and children around the world continue to suffer every single day and will suffer long into the future, as long as Chevron is not engaged in full-scale cleanup of their environmental damage. Chevron reports with pride its increasing profits in the billions while hoarding money that should be paid out to those victims continuing to struggle for survival. People who have no money to live on, let alone mitigate the deadly damage. This year, Chevron reported quadrupling their profits in the first quarter and are the only big oil company doing business today in Russia. They profit from declared genocide, as in the case of Myanmar. Chevron must undergo change, if not by its management, then by its shareholders, away from spending millions of shareholders' monies on legal ploys to avoid paying for their continuing crimes against the people in those communities where they work. Considering these findings, I'm moving a resolution on behalf of shareholders represented by New Ground Social Investment, calling on the board to lower the threshold from 15% to 10% of holders of outstanding stock, requiring for calling a special meeting of shareholders to examine the extreme behaviors of the company and to understand the true value of the company given the multiple and severe judgments and settlement debts already awarded and pending payment well over $50 billion. Did the board sign off on false and misleading financial statements, or did sworn testimonies to the US government represent perjury? The board needs to set the record straight and immediately. If Chevron claims not to owe any of the damages to communities around the world, they must give as evidence as to why. The 71 cases in my report show how dire Chevron's mismanagement has become. Newground Social Investment has joined several other shareholders in requesting the SEC investigate these reporting discrepancies. Just how many shareholders will be punished by the company's lawyers? Shareholders deserve a mechanism by which management teams who fail to exercise proper redress of damages can be questioned and held to account. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greer. I also want to point out that in response to the resolution, Chevron offered no specific response to the allegations or to the documentation in that report of those cases in the $50 billion. It simply dismissed it outright without offering a specific response, which I think is very telling to shareholders. And I hope the industry press pays close attention to that and follows up. CEO Wirth has failed to respond to questions from Congress when he testified in October, and has, up to now, completely ignored their questions about this report. Next, I'd like to ask everyone's patience. We're going to have to push questions to the end out of respect for the remaining speakers, but we're getting a lot of great questions and we will get to them. I'd like to move it to our section on climate and introduce Kathy Mulvey, Accountability Campaign Director with the Union of Concerned Scientists, to talk about Chevron emissions and climate disinformation. Thank you, Kathy, for being here.
Thanks, Paul. So I would like to set the stage for the climate change section of the program by outlining what science tells us about Chevron's outsized role in climate destruction and climate disinformation. And I have three main points that shareholders should consider as they cast their votes ahead of Chevron's annual meeting. One, scientists can now quantify Chevron's contributions to global warming emissions and particular climate impacts. Two, peer-reviewed research finds that Chevron's climate claims are greenwashing because the company's actions and investments don't match up with its promises. And three, Chevron's past and ongoing climate deception is worsening the climate crisis with Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, poor and working class communities, and communities in the global South being hurt first and worst. So next slide, please. First point is that scientists can now attribute changes in the climate to specific emission sources. According to peer-reviewed scientific studies, nearly 2/3 of all industrial carbon emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution can be traced to just 90 carbon producers. Chevron is responsible for more global warming emissions than any other investor-owned fossil fuel company since 1965, which is a significant date because by then, fossil fuel company decision makers knew of the harms that their oil, gas, and coal products would cause to the climate. Research led by my UCS colleagues, Dr. Brenda Eckwurzel and Dr. Rachel Licker, has attributed impacts such as global temperature increase, sea level rise, and ocean acidification to particular fossil fuel producers. Among investor-owned companies, Chevron has contributed the most to these negative impacts that are affecting people and ecosystems around the world. These studies are also informing a rising tide of litigation in the US and around the world seeking to hold Chevron and other major fossil fuel producers accountable for their role in climate change, which poses a financial and reputational risk to the company. Second, company actions fall far short of what science says is necessary to limit the worst effects of climate change. And according to the latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sharp cuts in fossil fuels are urgently needed to keep the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement within reach. A recent peer-reviewed study that drew on UCS's climate accountability scorecard found that Chevron and 3 of its peers continue to depend on fossil fuels with insignificant and opaque spending on clean energy. The researchers concluded that accusations of greenwashing appear well-founded. So failure to back up words with actions can be a legal liability. Chevron is the subject of a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission for deceptive advertising. And my third point, Chevron still refuses to make a clean break from climate disinformation. Chevron's record of deceiving people and policymakers about climate science goes back decades. A Chevron representative was among the contributors to an infamous plan laid out under the auspices of the American Petroleum Institute in 1998. The task force mapped out a multifaceted strategy to use scientists as spokesperson for the industry's views and to reach the media, the public, and policymakers with a message emphasizing uncertainties in climate science. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment concluded that addressing climate change harms, quote, has been made more urgent by delays due to misinformation about climate science that has sowed uncertainty and impeded recognition of risk. Yet in sworn testimony before the US House of Representatives last October, Chevron Chair and CEO Michael Wirth refused to commit to stop funding climate disinformation or efforts to block climate action. In February, Wirth became the chair of the American Petroleum Institute, which has tried to use Russia's war on Ukraine as an excuse for stalling or rolling back the transition to renewable energy. And just last week, the Philippines Commission on Human Rights concluded a nearly 7-year inquiry into the role of Chevron and other major carbon producers in climate-related impacts on the human rights of the Filipino people. The Commission's report, informed by UCS and many other experts, concluded that these companies engaged in willful obfuscation of climate science. These acts, the Commission said, may be bases for liability, and at the very least, they are immoral. So Chevron's lies are hurting all of us and disproportionately harming Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, poor and working class communities, and communities in the Global South. And I'll turn it back to Paul.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I'd like to turn to Betsy Middleton to follow this, who will talk about item 5, about the adoption of medium and long-term global greenhouse gas reduction targets.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me. Thanks to UCS for organizing this event and to all the previous speakers. It's an honor to speak alongside people working on such important topics. I'm Betsy and I'm representing Follow This here. Follow This is a global NGO that addresses climate change by filing shareholder resolutions at large oil companies. This is the second year that we've filed a climate proposal at Chevron, and our 2022 resolution, which you can see on the slide here, asks that the company set and publish targets that are consistent with the goal of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. We ask that these quantitative targets cover the short, medium, and long-term greenhouse gas emissions of the company's operations and the use of its energy products, so that's scope 1, 2, and 3. I'll take the next slide, please. Follow This first filed at Chevron last year, and we requested the companies to substantially reduce their scope 3 emissions, the emissions of their products, in the medium and long term. Chevron's existing strategy failed to address around 90% of the emissions that they have by omitting any target for the emissions of their products. Nevertheless, last May, Chevron claimed that their strategy was sufficient and advised shareholders to vote against the Follow This resolution. A majority of investors defied the board's advice, and the proposal received around a 61% majority amidst a watershed year of support for climate proposals at oil and gas companies. Since this shareholder mandate, Chevron have responded by updating their medium-term target to include scope 3. Unfortunately, this target promises a mere 5% reduction in intensity of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 2028 altogether. This response is at odds with shareholder support for substantial emission reductions. In order to meet the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, as we've heard from previous speakers, and both the IPCC and the IEA, absolute emissions must be reduced by more than 35% in the next decade, including in the oil and gas industry. Chevron's intensity metric and their target gives them ample space to increase absolute emissions if their production increases, which it did last year according to their Q4 results, and which it is forecasted to continue to do so. Furthermore, by grouping all their targets together, all their scopes together in one target, Chevron aims to convince shareholders that they've increased their ambition without providing any tangible evidence that they've addressed the main concern expressed by support for last year's proposal. That's the Scope 3 emissions. The company's 2050 target also lags behind the goal of the Paris Agreement and the steps that many of their peers are taking. Their long-term target only covers the emissions of their operations. This neglects more than 90% of the company's total emissions in their long-term plan for addressing the energy transition. Many companies and businesses, governments, and financial institutions are committed to fully decarbonising the economy by 2050. Chevron as a company risks losing market share and access to capital if they don't keep pace with these ambitions. Finally, Chevron continues to obstruct important policy progress on climate governance through their influence on various industry associations. Ultimately, the company holds the rapidly declining view that oil and gas will continue to make the majority of the energy mix in the next 30 years and beyond that. In short, the inclusion of Scope 3 emissions in Chevron's new medium-term target is an important step in finally acknowledging the responsibility for the emissions of their products. But their business plan remains far from aligned with 1.5 degrees, and their ambition lags significantly behind their industry peers and behind the expectations of their shareholders. I'll take the next slide, please. Chevron have shown that they're able to respond when investors use the ballot to support better climate strategies and show concern for transitional risk. But the company's ambition is too low. The proposal that we filed this year requests that Chevron align their current targets with the goals of the Paris Agreement. When left to decide on their own, Chevron have opted for immediate profit at the expense of increasing risk to their shareholders and to themselves in the long term. This year, investors can show that they demand urgency and leadership in the transition in order to protect their assets by giving Chevron a mandate to set the necessary targets. Investors who vote for the Follow This proposal this year will send a clear message. They won't be appeased by minute performative intensity targets and are rather committed to supporting energy companies to remain competitive in the transition and to protect shareholder assets in a rapidly decarbonising economy. We filed an exempt solicitation for this proposal. I think the link will be included in the chat, and that goes into some of these arguments in more detail. I hope that the Chevron shareholders present at the webinar today share our sense of urgency and that we can rely on your votes in the upcoming AGM. And my contact is available, and I'm open to questions from the audience now or after the webinar if something else comes up. Thank you.
Thanks, Betsy. We have just two more speakers and then we can get to questions. Next, Alison LaFrance with Climate Fellow with As You Sow to talk about the item number 6, resolution on net zero emissions.
Great, thanks, Paul. And I guess I'll just kind of jump right in with some background on As You Sow's resolution filed with Chevron this year. Like Paul said, item number 6. So some background: in 2019 and 2020, global accounting and auditing standard setters, including IFRS and US GAAP, clarified that material climate-related risks should be included in accounts and audits. However, a recent carbon tracker report found that 72% of companies reviewed did not follow through on their discussion of climate risks or emission targets in their financial statements or acknowledge any inconsistencies between the two reportings. Investors are increasingly concerned about these inconsistencies between unaudited climate reporting and audited financial statements and are looking to get further discussion from companies on climate-related risks in audited disclosures. And Chevron is one of these inconsistent companies. As it continues to develop new fossil fuel resources, Chevron acknowledges in its sustainability reporting that climate-related risks could impact reported financial metrics, but then doesn't address those risks in actual financial statements. And this is important because many items in Chevron's financial statements are based on estimates of future cash flows. So whether Chevron's business plan is based on a high or low carbon future can materially impact its accounts. Climate-related matters such as declining demand for oil and gas, the switch to renewable energy for power, and the phase out of internal combustion engines can directly and significantly affect financial statement results. For example, climate matters can lead to shorter estimated useful lives for productive assets, inventory obsolescence, and reduced revenues. So the oil, gas, or carbon prices used in estimating future cash flows are materially important for understanding Chevron's current financial statements. However, the company does not disclose this information, declaring it commercially sensitive, despite the fact peers have released their own assumptions. Chevron's business as usual approach would assume the continued growth in demand for hydrocarbons for the next several decades. By contrast, the International Energy Agency's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario reflects the global adoption of net zero commitments, which would see a steep year-on-year reduction in oil and gas demand. Specifically, the scenario forecasts oil prices falling to $36 a barrel in 2030 and $24 a barrel in 2050. This is in comparison to the spike in prices seen this year, reaching nearly $140 a barrel. This is all to emphasize that if a company ignores the clear signs that dramatic changes lie ahead, as we see with the onslaught of net zero commitments, it runs the risks of overstating assets or understating liabilities, all to the detriment of the company and ultimately investors. And you can go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so our proposal is asking Chevron to provide an audited report addressing how the application of the assumptions in the IEA's net zero scenario would affect the estimates of Chevron's financial statements, including its long-term commodity and carbon prices, remaining asset lives, asset retirement obligations, capital expenditures, and impairments. The proposal is seeking information on the difference between the inputs used by Chevron and its financial statements and what the resulting dollar impact would be on Chevron's financial standing if the IEA's net zero pathway inputs were used instead. Asking for this analysis will help to verify the company's claims that its risks are minimal even in a low carbon scenario. Chevron has responded by saying its climate change resilience report released in October addresses the asks of the proposal. However, the analysis does not provide quantifiable information the proposal asks for, and further, it is not an audited report. Essentially, all Chevron says in relation to the impacts of the IEA scenario on its business is that oil, gas, and coal consumption will decrease, renewables will increase, oil and gas prices will decrease, and thus revenues will go down. But investors want specific, quantifiable monetary impacts, not just a general or anecdotal discussion. Furthermore, this proposal received a nearly 48% vote in support at last year's AGM, and Chevron still has not adequately addressed the issue. And just to compare to some peers, oil majors Shell, BP, Equinor, and Total all disclose assumed oil and gas prices, which provide investors with actionable information regarding their divergence from those inputs provided in the net zero scenario. And in 2021, Shell included in its financial statements property, plant, and equipment sensitivities to different climate scenarios and an impairment sensitivity to changes in commodity price assumptions. Given the fact that some of Chevron's peers in Europe have disclosed the commodity prices they use, for Chevron to not disclose this information simply deprives US market investors of information available in other jurisdictions and the ability to compare climate risks and impacts across companies. And so we're seeing in Europe, some investors have taken to declaring their vote intentions to hold boards, audit committee members, and auditors to account for Paris-aligned financial statements. And if investor expectations on this matter aren't taken seriously, we expect to see this momentum grow in the future. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Happy to take questions at the end.
Thanks, Allison. Finally, we move to Mary Minette, Director of Shareholder Advocacy with Mercy Investment Services, to talk about item number 7, the resolution regarding methane.
Thanks, Paul. So our proposal concerns the company's measurement and management of a key greenhouse gas in methane, which, if you don't know, has 80 times greater heat trapping potential than carbon dioxide. So it's a large problem, but it's also one that is solvable. Methane actually dissipates more quickly than CO2 does in the atmosphere. So if we're able to tackle it quickly, it buys us time to deal with some of the more complex issues related to climate change. when it comes to the oil and gas industry, methane leakage is fairly pervasive. We have a huge system of wellheads and pipelines and storage tanks, all of which have the potential to leak methane into the atmosphere. And the problem is that companies have to know where these leaks are happening in order to manage it. And to date, most of the leak detection has been fairly sporadic. Companies report their methane emissions using estimates rather than direct measurement. And NGOs like EDF have found that those estimates are often wildly off from the reality. So this is a big problem. So what we're asking Chevron to do is a report that talks about the reliability of their methane measurement and management. We're specifically asking them to tell us how much direct measurement they do, what that direct measurement is telling them about the difference between that and their estimates of methane emissions, and also what direct measurement might mean for their estimates of methane in their scope 1 emissions. So I feel a bit like I'm bearing the lead here, but after some conversations with the company, when we got the proxy statement draft, they actually have agreed to support our proposal. So they will be doing this report that we've requested. We still would appreciate everybody voting for it, because a very high vote shows that there's a lot of support for and interest in this issue, because it really is critical that they get this under control if they are to tackle their greenhouse gas emissions and their problems with methane over time. But it's an interesting situation to be in, and quite frankly, one that I've never been in before, where the company has told us that they will actually do what we've asked them to do. But it is still, as I said, on the ballot, and we would appreciate your support. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. So we actually have come to the end of our group of speakers, and we do have time for questions. I also want to point out that if for some reason we don't get to it, or if you want to have more of a one-on-one and interview with any of the panelists, you can email me. I will connect you with them. Again, it's paz@amazonwatch.org. So we have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get through as many as we can in the time we have, and if we need to bargain for more time and people can stay, that's great. First, one of the questions that came in was a pretty broad one, but important. What will it take to bring Chevron to justice? And I'd like to ask both Alfredo and Nan Greer to take a stab at that one, and if others want to chime in too, let us know.
I guess I can start addressing that. The first thing that should happen is the support of the measure introduced by New Ground Social Impact Investing. And that is to support dropping the percentage rate from 15% to 10%, so shareholders have the ability to keep the company accountable to what they've done. I would also encourage everyone to contact their congressmen and senators and to implore them to make sure that Chevron addresses the damages that they've done and the $50 billion worth of judgments that are outstanding in payments, and definitely to support that with their government assistance.
I think I'll add kind of to what Dr. Greer said. Really restoring the harm that's been done is a big part of it. I think in our local context here in Richmond, really restorative investment in our communities in a way that we have autonomy over that investment. Kind of, holding themselves responsible for the harm that's been done to the community, removing themselves from this political pollution that they have caused in the city, and really aiding us towards ultimately what we want to be a just transition, a just transition away from fossil fuels, and beyond aiding that transition and investing in workers to be trained for, green energy jobs, to simply stop getting in the way would be kind of cool. Like I mentioned, the Air District passed, for example, Rule 65, and that it will be transformative in terms of public health, and immediately went into litigation. Immediately, a lawsuit was filed, and so kind of, to stop doing things like those would be, the bare minimum.
Thank you, Alfredo. And, I'd like to add on top of that, with respect specifically to the Ecuador case, there is still and will be ongoing efforts to enforce the Ecuadorian judgment outside of the United States. Chevron spent billions of dollars and used thousands of lawyers to block enforcement of that judgment in the United States, but that's the only place that it has blocked it. And its retaliatory slap suit, which was baseless and based on the testimony of a bribed witness, has been disparaged and exposed for the sham that it is. And so therefore has much less weight to affect the ability of the Ecuadorians to pursue justice and enforce that judgment in any of the other countries where Chevron has assets around the globe, of which there are many. So there are ongoing efforts to do that, but most importantly, people need to continue to spread the information about what Chevron did, what it admitted to doing, and the sham of its response to try to block coverage of the story of what happened in Ecuador and the truth of what you saw Donald present directly, the ongoing contamination that exists to this day. Another question is, I'm curious about your thoughts on BlackRock's recent announcement basically saying it would not vote for resolutions that are, quote, too prescriptive. Betsy, do you have a response to that question?
Sure, thanks, Paul. So the prescriptive caveat, especially in the US, is really important. And all of the proposals filed in the US go through a rigorous check by the SEC, the financial regulators, and companies can oppose resolutions being put on the ballot if they find them to be too prescriptive, and are given the opportunity to argue their case in a legal setting, in which case the proponent also sends an argument in and the SEC decides. In the case of Chevron, seeing as we're speaking of Chevron, for the follow this proposal, they did not contend on the grounds that the resolution was too prescriptive. And this is probably due to some developments in the SEC regarding climate resolutions specifically in the last year or so, which is now allowing Paris-aligned to be a caveat in some proposals. But I think what BlackRock's statement is referring to is the fact that we are now including the caveat that targets should be Paris-aligned, and having that external metric is considered micromanagerial or prescriptive by some standards in the finance industry. But I think what we need to understand is that there's certainly a need for management to be able to be flexible, to deal with the complex and uncertain reality of conducting business. But this doesn't always lead to management pursuing socially optimal or financially optimal, in this case, options when they're given the choice. And there's a need to harmonize certain company action to more universally recognized standards like the Paris Agreement. And I think that there's a real shift taking place, and BlackRock would do well to keep pace with that and with the expectations of the larger international community.
Thanks. Another question was, my brother controls a trust that I benefit from, which has Chevron in it. What's the short cheat sheet for me to give him as to how to vote? Ivy, can you respond to that one?
I actually am not sure that we have, I think that would be, at Majority Action, we have a proxy voting guide, but it only recommends votes against directors, which I'm happy to circulate or drop into the chat here. But as far as the other proposals, I actually don't have a cheat sheet, which seems like this would be a great resource to come out of this group. The boom, 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 here's how you want to vote. I know I get that question from my parents a lot on their pension fund. So.
And ICCR has a document, I believe, that they put out. If someone can post a link to that in the chat, you could see that there too. basically vote yes on all of the resolutions that you've heard talked about today that's the quick cheat sheet on it. Next, we have a question that says, if you are not a direct investor but hold Chevron through an asset manager like Vanguard, Fidelity, and Vanguard is the largest asset manager invested in Chevron, BlackRock, I think is second. Can we put pressure on these sources for support of Chevron or support for the resolutions? I assume that's what it means. How do we do it? Kathy, can you have a good response to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because so many people who are fortunate to have a pension investments don't hold stock in companies directly, but rather through mutual funds or through, if they're public employees, through a state pension fund. And so UCS is actually pulling together an action alert for our supporters ahead of the annual meeting, where we'll be inviting our supporters to call on BlackRock and Vanguard, as well as the California state pension funds, if they live in California, to vote in line with what you heard from Ivy about from Majority Action against Chevron Chair Michael Wirth and Lead Director Ron Sugar, and to demand climate action by voting in favor of the climate-related proposals you've heard about here today. And just thinking about last year, there was a real shareholder revolt at ExxonMobil, and where actually climate-related proposals won majority support, and 3 seats on the board were put forward by a hedge fund and got support from BlackRock and major pension funds because of ExxonMobil's failure to adapt for the energy transition. And so it is really important for these asset owners and asset managers to hear from people, especially if you're a beneficiary of a state fund, or if you're invested in a mutual fund, because we know from Follow This that Vanguard voted for the climate proposal at Chevron last year, but hasn't yet come out on how it will vote on climate targets. So yeah.
Thank you for that. And there's another quick question I just want to knock it real quick is, can we cast a vote if we buy a few shares? Yes, you can, but you can't do it in this upcoming shareholder meeting. You have to do it ahead of time so that you get the proxy statement in the mail, and then you can register your vote. So, it is worth, I believe you only need 1 share. And then you will also get access to the Chevron meeting, which is online this year, as has been for the last few years, but often is in person, either in San Ramon at their headquarters, or sometimes in Houston or Midland, Texas. Good luck going out to Midland, Texas for that one. So another question that we have, which is a big one, and I want to take it on, which is about specifically the case of Stephen Donziger. If people don't know, Stephen Donziger is a human rights lawyer who was one of the lead lawyers in the original suit against Texaco in the United States, and has been involved in the case ever since, going back to 1993. Stephen Donziger has been the target of Chevron. They have not only gone after him to freeze his ability to do his work, seize his assets, take his law license away, but literally criminalize him for the work that he did to hold Chevron to account and his part in the victory of the Ecuadorian judgment of 2011. This entire scheme of Chevron's is an incredibly chilling one for the corporate accountability movement, because it's a deliberate attempt to circumvent the Ecuadorian justice system by employing complicit US judges to suppress the rights of access to justice for the Ecuadorians and their advocates, and using the RICO law, which is a law created to go after the mob in the 70s, to assert that Stephen Donziger and everyone and anyone working on behalf of the Ecuadorians was in fact involved in a global conspiracy to extort money from Chevron. This is after the fact that the company admitted to the deliberate contamination in Ecuador that you saw from Donald. They do not deny having dumped. They do not deny having dumped as a cost-saving measure, having dumped billions of gallons, and having done it over the course of decades. They assert that a portion of those pits are their responsibility and that they cleaned them up. And you saw with your own eyes some of those allegedly cleaned up pits. So even the things that Chevron admitted to doing, it said it hadn't actually cleaned it up. And worse, it has used this retaliatory attack against Donziger to try to rewrite history. It has prevented many news outlets from writing stories about this, and its CEO is now actually literally denying the scientific proof of contamination. He said in the shareholder meeting a couple of years ago, if there were any scientific evidence of contamination, the Ecuadorians wouldn't have had to make up their fraudulent case. So what Chevron did was preemptively file a suit in the United States against Stephen Donziger and a few Ecuadorians, and named many co-conspirators, including Amazon Watch, journalists, activists, shareholders, anyone who had been involved in supporting the Ecuadorians, and said they were part of this global conspiracy. What's important about this RICO lawsuit is that it specifically excluded any evidence of contamination in Ecuador from those proceedings. So this was not a judge looking at the evidence of what happened and ruling for or against Chevron. This was a judge who decided not to talk about any of the contamination and simply went after Donziger under Chevron's claims that he ghost wrote the judgment and that he bribed a judge. The witness who testified, who offered the actual evidence of that ghostwriting and bribery, was paid $2 million by Chevron, coached 53 days, lied on the stand, and later admitted under oath that he lied on the stand to get a payout from Chevron. And this is known worldwide, yet that decision is still held up as an attempt to suppress people from working on the Ecuadorian case. Using that decision, Chevron's lawyers, Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, went back to the judge, Kaplan, who issued that decision, and asked him to bring up contempt of court charges against Stephen Donziger if he didn't cease working with people to enforce that judgment outside the United States. And that's why he was targeted, hit with contempt of court, and then hit with criminal contempt of court, thrown into jail, and held for almost 3 years on a petty misdemeanor charge, which is a clear retaliation for his work on behalf of the Ecuadorians. It's been acknowledged by Amnesty International, Greenpeace, by the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention as a retaliatory attack for his work on behalf of indigenous and other communities in Ecuador who are facing this contamination that Chevron admitted to doing. And all of what I have laid out to you is unique. These things have never happened to a lawyer in the United States, and it's incredibly chilling for those who would advocate on behalf of communities affected by this entire industry, and of course, specifically Chevron. You heard that there's already $50 billion of outstanding money owed to communities and governments that Chevron has harmed. What hope have they to bring cases to get justice in the United States if the US judiciary is helping Chevron's lawyers to vilify and criminalize lawyers who go after it? So 11 members of Congress have recently spoken out against this. They are calling on Joe Biden to pardon Stephen Donziger, to investigate the abuse of justice, and to compensate him for the almost 3 years that he spent on house arrest. If you want to find out more about that, freedonziger.com is a good website to go to about it. AmazonWatch.org has posted many posts about Stephen's case specifically. He will be at that event that I mentioned on May 21st at the Chevron Richmond refinery. So any press or others who want to come out and talk with him about it specifically, you're welcome to join us there on that day. And obviously I could talk about that all day. So if you have more specific questions about it, please feel free to hit me up and I will set up a meeting with you. I think there was one other question that came in for Donald, which is about the state of the fauna and wildlife as a result of the pools left behind. We're talking about an area about the size of Manhattan that is still contaminated with oil waste. And every day, toxins from those pits leach into local waterways when it rains in the Amazon, which it does almost every day. There have been efforts to install filtration systems for communities to drink clean water. Many indigenous communities working with local organizations have implemented those things, and that over time is getting improved. But that's still, that contamination is still a daily fact of life for the 30,000 plus people who live in that area. Where Chevron said pits were cleaned, many communities moved. They built homes, they started farms, they raised livestock. The livestock got sick and died, the farms fell apart, the people and children who lived on those over those pits developed cancer and died. They are part of that list of 2,000 people that you heard Donald talk about. So this part of the Amazon is now referred to as the Amazon Chernobyl. And no one has actually implemented an effective or systematic measure to clean it up, which is what the Ecuadorian judgment is about. It is not about enriching lawyers, NGOs, or even individuals. It is to pay for a cleanup, a remediation, and healthcare costs for all the people impacted by Chevron's operations. And it is outrageous that to this day, 11 years later, the company refuses to spend a single dime to clean up this toxic waste. If there's, are there any other questions that I missed that I should make sure? Are there any other last comments from any of our speakers about any of those questions or things that you left off? Okay, so so the last Wednesday of the month is the Chevron shareholder meeting. If you don't already have access and want to get access to that meeting too, there are ways to do so. So please reach out to us on email. And if you are a member of the press or with a group that has voting power, please let us know if you have follow-up questions, and we'd love to get your support on these resolutions. Thank you so much to all of these amazing speakers. I'm so grateful to the time, to the effort, to your work, to your dedication, and especially to Alfredo and especially to Donald, those most impacted on a daily basis by the operation of this company. Your solidarity is very important to the people of Ecuador and to the people in Richmond and around the globe who stand on the front lines of this fight for justice from Chevron. Thanks again, especially to the Union of Concerned Scientists, Hannah and Flavi, especially. Thank you so much. We will let you all know when you can reach this recording online and be in touch about a follow-up press release. Enjoy the rest of your day.